In my final year of theology studies, that was 1970, at the University of Toronto, I enrolled in a course, The Human Person in a Stressful World. The course instructor was Dr. James Wilkes, a psychiatrist connected with the Clark Institute of Psychiatry, now part of Toronto's Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. Until then, I was 25 years old. I had apprehended no more of psychiatry than the silly caricatures and the stupid jokes that popularly surround shrinks and wig pickers. Months later, I emerged from the course not merely with medical information I had heretofore lacked, I emerged with a new world. Wilkes hadn't simply added several items to my mental furniture, he had admitted me to a world I didn't know to exist. What was the world? It was the complexity of the human person, together with the multidimensionality, the pervasiveness, and the relentlessness of human suffering. It was the configuration of the stresses, frequently swelling to distresses, intrapsychic, social, biological, historical, religious, that bear upon people, together with the configurations of responses to such stresses. Now, some responses to stress are individual. Stress stimulates some people to greater achievement, while stress causes other people to break down. Other responses are social. Institutionalization, whether in hospital or prison, is one social response to stress. Now, my debt to Dr. Wilkes is unpayable. Not least, he introduced me to the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and as a result, I gained even deeper appreciation of the scope, profundity, and versatility of human suffering. He spared me lifelong shallowness born of ignorance, spared me a simplistic, unrealistic approach to the people I would see every day for the next 40 years as a working pastor. 1 month after the course with Dr. Wilkes ended, I was ordained. In no time, I was living and working in northeastern New Brunswick, one of the most economically deprived areas of Canada. And just as quickly, I found myself face to face with people whose psychiatric difficulties were the common cold of the psychiatric world. For instance, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia. I also witnessed suffering less commonly seen in the 20th century, such as hysterical paralysis, that is, episodic leg immobility in someone devoid of a physical impediment, and even hysterical blindness, when someone was put on the spot, high anxiety situation in a troubling social environment, only to find her vision disappearing and returning repeatedly. My work as pastor on behalf of psychiatric sufferers found me conversing with family physicians and psychiatrists. Both groups, but especially psychiatrists, frequently appeared suspicious of clergy and even occasionally disdainful. And soon I learned why. Too many clergy, at least of that era, tended to a facile, one-sided pronouncement concerning psychiatric patients as possessing inadequate faith and defective trust in God. Psychiatric sufferers were haunted by a guilt they were supposed to have. In addition, they were self-absorbed. Now, the clergy proposed cure was simple. All such spiritual problems could be shed through a combination of positive thinking, exercise of the will, and greater faith. The medical fraternity appeared to think the clergy only worsened the sufferer's predicament, in that to their anguish were now added guilt. These people were manifest spiritual failures, and anxiety. They feared they lacked the spiritual resources for rising above their pain. Thanks to Dr. Wilkes, I was spared such simplistic glibness. Equipped with what I had gained from him, I revisited my theological formation, now keeping in mind the subtleties and complexities of human distress, determined to avoid naive assessments and subtle accusations of personal deficiency, if not personal failure, determined to avoid, in short, a false spiritualization of somebody's suffering. As I revisited my theological understanding, I developed a constellation of key spiritual themes found in the Abrahamic tradition. This constellation of key spiritual themes formed the matrix of my ministry to psychiatric sufferers. The first is elemental. God is for us. 3,000 years ago, the psalmist exalted, "This I know, that God is for me." Now, this conviction is the bass note, the downbeat, the ever-recurring throb. It remains the stable basis and the governing truth of everything else. God is for us. It's picked up again in the Apostle Paul's letter to the church in Rome. If God is for us, who is against us? The force of the assertion is, if God is for us, who could ever be against us ultimately, regardless of all appearances to the contrary? Since appearances to the contrary abound in anybody's life, and especially in the ill person's life, it cannot be insisted too often that God is for us. Now, to be sure, those who belong to any of the Abrahamic traditions arising from the book, Holy Scripture, that is, those belonging to the Jewish, Islamic, and Christian communities, are always aware that the book says a great deal else about God. God is judge, God is wrathful, God's face is set against evildoers, and so on. Ill people, I have found, tend to fasten on these texts, convinced that their illness is the result of God's anger concerning them and God's judgment upon them. The general tenor of Scripture, however, is wholly different. To be sure, God is judge. Isn't any person who lacks judgment anywhere in life someone to be pitied? Unlike our judgment, however, God's judgment is always the converse of his mercy. Remember that. God's judgment is always the converse of his mercy. God bothers to judge us only because God has first resolved to rescue us and restore us. God's judgment then is always and only the first installment of our restoration and the guarantee of its completion. Since, according to the book, God is love, love isn't merely something God does, the implication being that God could, if he wished, do something other than love. Rather, since God is love, love is all God is, and therefore all God can do. God can never not love, never act in a way that contradicts his character. God's wrath, said Martin Luther, is God's love burning hot, but always and everywhere his love. Mentally ill people, let me repeat, tend to assume their illness is the result of God's displeasure with them. Two comments have to be made here. One, their illness isn't the result of God's displeasure. Two, if elsewhere in life they have mobilized God's displeasure, ill people frequently like to remind me that ill though they may be, they're still sinners. God's judgment is only his love setting us right. God's judgment is God's mercy beginning its work of restoration. God is for us. This note has to be sounded relentlessly, for this note determines the rhythm of human existence. The second item in the constellation of key spiritual themes. God shares our vulnerability not least because God is vulnerable himself. Ill people, I have found, fault themselves remorselessly for not being invulnerable, for not being strong enough, able enough, competent enough, resilient enough, in short, for not being inviolable. They assume that finitude, limitation, weakness isn't or isn't supposed to be part of our humanness. They fault themselves for not being invulnerable in the face of life's assaults. I've noticed, by the way, that psychiatric sufferers who fault themselves for their fragility would never fault themselves if they suffered a broken leg in a car accident. Without hesitation, they would fault the driver whose car struck them. In other words, when they are physically incapacitated, they feel they can legitimately blame someone else. But when they are psychiatrically incapacitated, they feel they can only blame themselves. There has arisen in our society a miasma that continues to settle upon and soak into the populace at large, namely, We are, or are supposed to be, invincible, devoid of fragility, frailty, and finitude. We are, or are supposed to be, nothing less than titanic in our capacity to withstand life's assaults. We are, or are supposed to be, possessed of an omnicompetence amounting to omnipotence. Worse, such omnipotence is deemed to be an attribute of God, and therefore a property of us who are made in God's image. Omnipotence, however, understood as unmodified, unconditioned power, is simply terrible. A moment's reflection should assure us that power for the sake of power, power unmodified, power unqualified by anything, sheer power is sheer evil. Then why attribute it to God? More profoundly, power, properly understood, is always the capacity to achieve purpose. What is God's purpose? A people who love him and honor him as surely as he loves and honors us. How does God achieve such a purpose? Through God's own vulnerability. The Abrahamic traditions refer alike to the one who repeatedly, characteristically suffers at the hands of his people, and yet he never abandons them. God's suffering in these traditions is likened to many things, but everywhere in Holy Writ, God's suffering is likened most often to a woman in end-stage labor whose child, conceived in pure joy, has brought her greater distress than she could have imagined, yet who will not renounce the struggle but must see it through until the child who is her delight is in her hands and on her lap. So it is with God. From a Christian perspective specifically, the cross attests God's limitless vulnerability. He hasn't spared himself anything for our sakes, while the resurrection attests the limitless efficacy of limitless vulnerability. Not only are we humans unable to escape our vulnerability, regardless of the messages that advertisers beam upon us, to want to escape our fragility is to want to be titanic. And to think we can escape it is to fancy ourselves gigantic. And to ignore our Creator who renders himself defenseless before us for our sakes. Psychiatric sufferers should be helped to see that their fragility isn't a sign of moral weakness or personal failure or uncommon ineptitude or unusual folly. They should be helped to see that owning their vulnerability, rather than denying it or attempting to flee it, owning it might just be essential to their recovery. Sufferers should be helped to see that their vulnerability is the leading edge of their triumph. The third item in the constellation of spiritual themes. God alone is the story writer who can render the negative, seemingly opaque developments and the details of our existence a story rather than a chaotic jumble that defies comprehension. Imagine a line in the middle of a novel. For instance, the man who had waited for hours finally walked away, dismayed that the woman hadn't noticed him. If the question were asked, what does that line mean? The obvious rejoinder would be, it all depends. It all depends on what preceded this event in the narrative. And no less, it all depends on what follows this event. Ultimately, it all depends on how the narrative turns out. That is, it all depends on the last chapter of the story. The mentally ill person persistently comments, I don't know why I'm ill. I don't understand what it's supposed to mean. I can't make any sense of my illness. Lack of meaning is a stress in anybody's life, yet lack of meaning is something that confronts us all whenever we're face to face with evil. We should admit that one aspect of evil's evilness is evil's sheer meaninglessness. To the extent that evil could be understood, it would be a rational event, and its evilness would be reduced by the explanation. What is evil is finally inexplicable and will always lack meaning, not least the evil of illness. In the face of the stress, that meaninglessness which makes the burden of illness all the more burdensome, the ill person is always prone to try to reduce the burden by positing a meaning, by finding a meaning, as it were, that actually isn't there, but the finding of which is easier to endure than no meaning at all. The problem here, however, is that the meaning that the ill person posits is arbitrary, it's unrealistic, and worst of all, the meaning that the ill person assigns to her illness is nearly always self-deprecating. Now she thinks that the meaning of her illness is that it was sent to teach her a lesson. What's the lesson? Or to remind her of personal failure, or to make major changes in her life, or to confirm her inherent wickedness. In the interest of reducing her burden, she has only increased it. The truth is, the meaning of any one event in anyone's life depends on several factors. In the first place, it depends on what has preceded the onset of illness. In the second place, it depends on what is yet to occur in that person's life, which can't be anticipated. And above all, it depends on the meta-narrative that gathers up and determines the ultimate significance of all the events, good and bad, in that person's life, which meta-narrative no one, ill or not, can write, inasmuch as no individual is the author of her own meta-narrative. All of us like to think we understand how life is unfolding and how life's ingredients are connected until a negativity occurs that is nothing less than absurd in the mathematical sense. That is, a development that doesn't fit anywhere and can't be seen to fit or be made to fit. Absurd development that defies the logic by which we had understood our own existence up to this point. Yet since the meaning of a story depends on the last chapter, and since the last chapter hasn't been written nor can be written by us, we must admit that for the present, illness remains absurd. We can't determine its meaning at this time, nor its place in the conclusive narrative that is anyone's life. People from the traditions of the book, however, maintain that the ultimate meaning of anyone's life can be entrusted to the one whose meta-narrative gathers up our self-determined myopic narratives and transmutes them into something whose meaning, truth, and splendor we can only await at this time, but which we need not doubt. The fourth and last item in the constellation of key spiritual themes. A community has to embody the truth it claims to cherish. In short, a community has to embody, exemplify the constellation of spiritual themes discussed to this point. Since the communities of the Abrahamic traditions maintain, for instance, that there is no human being anywhere in any predicament who is ever God-forsaken, the community that upholds this tradition has to embody it. Note, I didn't say that there's no human being who doesn't feel God-forsaken. Neither did I say that people don't have reason to feel God-forsaken. They manifestly have. Nonetheless, since it remains true that God doesn't abandon, despise, or reject, there has to be a community that doesn't abandon, despise, or reject. And our concrete embodiment of this truth takes at least two forms. Most simply, the community shares its material resources with those who are especially needy. Everyone is aware, of course, that there's a government-enforced, non-voluntary sharing of our material resources with the needy. This enforced, non-voluntary assistance is found in the combination of graduated income tax and social assistance and health care. While this arrangement isn't an explicit aspect of the life of church or synagogue or mosque, it is an indirect illumination arising from the witness of biblically informed communities. We ought never to sell it short, and we should continue to ask ourselves what might be the social texture of our society if secularism succeeds in extinguishing the indirect illumination of biblically informed peoples. The Mississauga congregation I pastored for 21 years partnered with the local synagogue and the Baha'i Fellowship in developing 2 affordable housing projects, total value $35 million. This housing accommodated needy people, among whom were many who were in psychiatric difficulty, and more than a few whose psychiatric condition was chronic. Quickly, we noticed that many of the people we housed were also undernourished, whereupon we developed Mississauga's first food bank. It operates to this day, and every year it distributes food whose market value is $12 million. Next, we noticed that many children were so poorly fed that they were underachieving at school, whereupon we fashioned a breakfast club in order to give them a nutritious start to the school day. The breakfast club was headed up by the Rebbetzin, the rabbi's wife. She served unstintingly for 25 years, and at one point there were 44 people from my own congregation serving in the breakfast club. The most elemental level of community is serving the neighbor's material scarcity through our material abundance. The second expression of community is sharing the neighbor's suffering. To share the neighbor's suffering where mental illness is concerned is at least to befriend that person and thereby at least reduce the suffering person's isolation and loneliness. The mentally ill person suffers what every human suffers in terms of frailty, disease, bodily breakdown through accident, sickness, and aging. In addition, the mentally ill person suffers from her particular psychiatric problem, indeed lives out that problem, as the non-psychiatrically afflicted do not live that problem at least. And in the third place, the mentally ill person suffers the social stigma visited upon the psychiatrically troubled. The community has to be aware of all 3 levels of such suffering and remain aware that such suffering cumulatively is an appalling burden. When I was a pastor in Mississauga, my wife and I invited back to lunch each Sunday a different family from the congregation. Several factors have to be noted here. 1, the unmarried person was still a family, unmarried for any reason, and should not be overlooked in a society that's almost exclusively couple-oriented. 2, in a congregation of 400 families, there were always several people who had been diagnosed with psychiatric problems. 3, the mentally ill person is not only suffering atrociously herself, her family is suffering too, in a different manner to be sure, but suffering no less. 4, while these people had been invited to lunch, if they were still sitting in our living room at 5 p.m., they were then invited to supper. Now, my point is this. I came to see that loneliness is an enormous problem. Not least loneliness among those one would think least likely to be lonely, since their outward lives seemed devoid of social deficit. Loneliness, especially in those whose mental illness heightened their isolation, and of course, loneliness in those people whose ill family member now found other people avoiding the family. In the course of our simple hospitality, we welcomed to our home and table the bipolar person, the obsessive-compulsive, the phobic, the schizophrenic, the substance-addicted, and those afflicted with personality disorders. Among these were the dual-diagnosed, that is, the mentally ill person who is also blind or hearing impaired or in trouble with the law. The role of the community of faith isn't to mimic the mental health professional. Certainly, it isn't to suggest that medical intervention is superfluous. The role of the community of faith is to render concrete its conviction that ill people matter and shouldn't be ignored. Not least, the role of the community of faith is to hold up, for the sufferer herself, but also for the wider society, the truth that the troubled of this earth have been appointed to a future release and recovery more glorious than their pain allows them to glimpse at this time. Thank you very much.